The Ozark wilderness of 1858 held both promise and peril for those seeking new beginnings. For Eliza Blackwood, the dense forests and rolling hills represented not just a frontier to be conquered, but a world she experienced differently from others, a world of profound silence. As the only deaf member of the Hargrove wagon train, she watched as bullets tore through the morning mist, never hearing the shots that claimed everyone she loved. Her story of survival against impossible odds would become intertwined with that of Badahi Kingfisher, a Cherokee tracker whose own path was marked by loss. Together, they would forge an unlikely alliance in a land where trust was as scarce as mercy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog hung heavy in the valleys of northwestern Arkansas, transforming the familiar shapes of wagons and livestock into ghostly silhouettes. Eliza Blackwood moved among these shapes with practiced ease, gathering kindling for the morning's cookfire. At 24, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied the challenges of her silent world. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple braid, practical for the journey, and her emerald eyes missed nothing. They had become her primary connection to the world around her. Born with the ability to hear, Eliza had lost that sense at age 12 when scarlet fever swept through her Pennsylvania hometown. The illness had taken her younger brother and left her in a world of silence. Her father, Edmund Blackwood, a skilled carpenter, had patiently taught her to read lips, to observe the subtle changes in expression that gave meaning to unheard words. Those skills had become second nature now, though they did little to ease the isolation she sometimes felt, even surrounded by the 23 other members of the Hargrove wagon train. The journey westward to the promised lands of northern Texas had been her father's dream, a fresh start for them both after her mother's passing the previous winter. Edmund had spoken of rich timberlands where his carpentry skills would be valued, of communities needing furniture and homes, of a place where they might finally put down roots. Eliza paused in her gathering, straightening to ease the ache in her back from sleeping on the hard ground. The morning was still, the camp not yet fully awake. Only Mr. Hargrove, the wagon master, and 2 of the men were up, huddled by the remnants of last night's fire, likely discussing the day's route. The Blackwood wagon stood at the outer edge of the circle, her father still asleep within. She had wandered nearly 60 yards from camp, following a small game trail where fallen branches provided dry kindling despite yesterday's rain. The dense underbrush and scattered pine trees provided enough cover that she could see the camp only in fragments. A wagon wheel here, the flick of a horse's tail there. It was this distance, this physical separation, that saved her life. Eliza didn't hear the first shots that shattered the morning calm. She didn't hear the screams that followed. It was only when she turned, arms full of kindling, that she saw the chaos erupting in the camp. Men on horseback, at least a dozen, had emerged from the southern tree line, guns blazing. Even at this distance, she could see they wore bandanas across their faces, their hats pulled low. The kindling tumbled from her arms as instinct took over. Eliza dropped to the ground, pressing herself against the damp earth, heart hammering against her ribs. Years of navigating a world without sound had heightened her other senses. The vibrations in the ground beneath her chest told of galloping horses. The metallic tang of gunpowder reached her nostrils on the morning breeze, and her eyes, wide with terror, captured the scene in horrifying detail. Mr. Hargrove fell first, reaching for the revolver at his hip, but too late. Mrs. Peterson, 5 months with child, stumbled from her wagon only to collapse beside the wheel. The Fitzgerald children, still in their night clothes, ran screaming toward the trees, only to be cut down before they'd gone 10 yards. And her father, Edmund Blackwood, emerged from their wagon, shotgun in hand. Eliza's mouth opened in a silent scream as she watched him take aim, fire, and strike one of the attackers. Then three of the masked men turned toward him, and in a hail of bullets, he disappeared from view. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The massacre couldn't have lasted more than 5 minutes, but to Eliza, frozen in terror and disbelief, it seemed both eternal and instantaneous. When the shooting stopped, the attackers dismounted, moving methodically through the camp, checking bodies, rifling through wagons, taking what they valued and destroying what they didn't. Eliza remained motionless, barely breathing, her body pressed so tightly against the earth that she could feel every pebble, every twig beneath her. She watched through a screen of underbrush as one of the men, taller than the rest with a distinctive red bandana, directed the others in their looting. 20 minutes later, laden with stolen goods, they remounted and rode west, leaving behind only destruction and silence, a silence that had always been Eliza's companion, but now felt vast and terrible. Only when the last rider had disappeared, from sight, did Eliza dare to move. Her limbs were stiff, her dress soaked with dew and mud. She rose to her knees first, then to her feet, swaying slightly as blood rushed back to her extremities. The camp lay before her, a tableau of horror, painted in harsh morning light. She should run, some distant part of her mind insisted. The attackers might return, but where? In which direction? And how could she leave without knowing, without seeing, without being certain about her father? Each step toward the camp required conscious effort. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet, the air too thick to breathe properly. Smoke from the scattered cook fires mingled with another scent, metallic and primal, that made her stomach clench. The first body she encountered was that of Evelyn Murray, the schoolteacher who had joined their wagon train in Missouri. Her blue dress was stained dark across the abdomen, her eyes open to the sky, seeing nothing. Eliza moved past her, past the Fitzgerald children huddled together in death as they had been in life, past Mr. Hargrove, whose final expression was one of surprise rather than fear. The Blackwood wagon stood as they had left it that morning, the canvas cover still secured. But beside it, crumpled like discarded paper, lay Edmund Blackwood. His shotgun remained clutched in his right hand, his left still pressed to his chest, where at least 3 bullets had found their mark. His eyes were closed, his expression almost peaceful. Eliza fell to her knees beside him, reaching with trembling fingers to touch his face. Still warm, but cooling rapidly in the morning air. She gathered him into her arms, cradling his head against her shoulder as she had once been cradled in his arms. During childhood thunderstorms, she couldn't hear, but could feel vibrating through the house. No sound escaped her lips. Grief beyond vocalization, beyond the capacity of a voice unused since childhood. But tears flowed freely, dropping onto the weathered face of the only family she had left in the world, the man who had been her protector, her teacher, her interpreter in a hearing world. How long she remained there she couldn't say. Time had lost all meaning. It was the shifting shadows that finally roused her, the realization that morning had given way to midday. The attackers could return. Predators could be drawn by the scent of blood. She had to move, had to act, had to survive. Edmund Blackwood had raised a practical daughter. Grief would have to wait. With gentle care, Eliza laid her father back on the ground, folding his hands across his chest. From around his neck, she removed the silver pocket watch that had been her grandfather's, tucking it into her own pocket. A promise, an oath. She would survive this, would carry something of him forward. Rising on unsteady legs, she assessed the situation with forced detachment. The attackers had been thorough. Supplies were scattered, clothing strewn about, but anything of value, money, jewelry, weapons, had been taken. The horses were gone, even the old mare with a lame foreleg that had pulled their wagon. but they had left the wagons themselves, too cumbersome to steal. And in her family's wagon, beneath a false panel in the floor that her father had cleverly constructed, lay emergency provisions: a hunting knife, a small bag of dried meat and fruit, a water canteen, a tinder box, and a folded oilcloth suitable for shelter. Retrieving these items, Eliza returned to where her father lay. She couldn't leave him exposed to the elements, to scavengers. With determination born of desperate love, she began the arduous task of digging a grave, using only the hunting knife and her bare hands. The sun had begun its westward descent by the time she finished, her nails broken and bleeding, her dress caked with dirt. The grave was shallow, too shallow, but it was all she could manage alone. She wrapped Edmund in the blanket from their wagon, whispered unspoken words of love against his cooling forehead, and covered him with earth and stones to deter animals. Standing at the foot of the crude grave, Eliza knew she should say something, some prayer or goodbye, but in her silent world, words had always been secondary to feeling, to the language of touch and expression that had become her primary mode of communication. So instead, she pressed her hand to her heart, then extended it toward the grave, a gesture her father would have understood. "I carry you with me, always." Night was approaching fast, bringing with it new dangers. Eliza gathered her meager supplies, securing them in a small pack fashioned from a torn blanket. She filled the canteen from the water barrel that had somehow remained intact during the massacre. Food would be limited to what she had found in their hidden cache, perhaps 3 days' worth if she rationed carefully. Direction was the next consideration. Going west would risk encountering the attackers. East led back toward settlements, but they were at least 6 days' journey on foot, maybe more given the rugged terrain. North meant mountains, increasingly difficult to traverse. South, then, toward the Cherokee Nation that lay beyond the Ozark foothills. Her father had mentioned trading posts where settlers and natives conducted business. If she could reach one. With the last light fading, Eliza took one final look at the campsite that had become a graveyard. 23 souls had perished here, good people with dreams of new beginnings. Only she remained, spared by the silence that had often felt like a burden, but had become her salvation. The irony wasn't lost on her. For years after losing her hearing, she had felt vulnerable, dependent on others to alert her to dangers she couldn't perceive. Now, that same deafness had saved her life. She hadn't reacted to the sounds of attack, hadn't fled in panic into the open where she would have been spotted, hadn't screamed and given away her position. Slinging the makeshift pack over her shoulder, Eliza turned south and began walking. The hunting knife, her only weapon, was secured at her waist, easily accessible. The fading light made the forest floor treacherous with hidden roots and uneven ground, but she pressed on, knowing that distance from the massacre site was her first priority. Each step took effort, her body already exhausted from digging, from grief, from shock. But with each step came a strengthening resolve. She would survive, she would find help. She would somehow make sense of the senseless violence that had stolen her future. Night fell completely, the forest transforming into a labyrinth of shadows. An owl swooped overhead, invisible but causing enough air displacement that Eliza sensed its passing. The temperature dropped rapidly, the spring night carrying the bite of lingering winter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When she could no longer see the path before her, Eliza found a sheltered spot between the sprawling roots of an ancient oak. She unfolded the oilcloth, creating a small lean-to against the tree trunk. The night was too dangerous for a fire. It might attract the wrong kind of attention. Instead, she wrapped herself in the remaining blanket, huddling against the tree's solid presence. Exhaustion should have brought immediate sleep, But Eliza's mind raced with images from the morning, with questions, with fears. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw her father falling, saw the masked men methodically moving through the camp, and saw Evelyn Murray's vacant stare. She clutched the hunting knife against her chest, its solid weight providing small comfort. Eventually, physical fatigue overcame mental anguish, and she drifted into fitful sleep, her dreams filled with running, with pursuers she couldn't hear, with the sensation of falling into endless darkness. Dawn broke with hazy indifference, filtering through the canopy in diffused beams that dappled the forest floor. Eliza woke with a moment of disorientation, her body stiff from the cold ground and awkward position. Reality crashed back immediately. The massacre, her father, her desperate flight south. Rising carefully, she stretched her aching limbs and took stock of her surroundings. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening but more complex, with multiple game trails branching in various directions. She needed to maintain her southward course and needed to find water soon to replenish her canteen. Using the rising sun to orient herself, Eliza chose what appeared to be the most direct route south. She allowed herself a small piece of dried beef and a conservative sip of water before continuing her journey. The day unfolded in a rhythm of walking, brief rests, careful observation. Without sound to guide her, Eliza relied entirely on visual cues. The movement of branches that might indicate humans or large animals, the direction of shadow, the subtle signs of game trails that might lead to water. By midday, her water supply was half depleted, and thirst had become a constant companion. It was the behavior of a group of sparrows that led her to water, their repeated flights to and from a particular direction that suggested a water source. Following their path, Eliza discovered a small stream cutting through the forest floor, its clear water tumbling over rocks worn smooth by centuries of flow. She refilled her canteen, then removed her boots to soak her blistered feet in the cool water. The momentary relief was almost overwhelming, bringing tears to her eyes that had nothing to do with grief. Small mercies, her father would have called them. The moments of grace that made survival possible. As she rested by the stream, movement across the water caught her attention, a deer approaching cautiously to drink. It lifted its head, sensing her presence, large eyes assessing the threat. For a long moment they regarded each other, two beings sharing the same essential need. Then, with a flick of its white tail, the deer bounded away, disappearing into the forest. The encounter left Eliza feeling less alone, reminding her that life continued in these woods, indifferent to human tragedy. She rose, pulled on her boots, and continued southward, following the stream for a time before it curved westward, away from her intended direction. By late afternoon, hunger had become a hollow ache, her small morning ration insufficient for the energy expended in walking. Eliza paused to assess her surroundings, looking for anything edible. Her knowledge of wild foods was limited, but her father had pointed out blackberry bushes during their journey, and she recognized the distinctive leaf pattern on a cluster of bushes nearby. The berries were not yet fully ripe, still more red than black, but she gathered them gratefully, their tart juice easing her parched throat. It wasn't substantial nourishment, but it would help extend her meager supplies. As dusk approached, Eliza sought higher ground, both for safety and to gain some perspective on her progress. A rocky outcropping provided the elevation she needed, and from its summit she could see the landscape unfolding before her. Miles of forested hills rolling southward, with what appeared to be a river valley in the far distance. How far she had traveled was difficult to judge, but the massacre site was well behind her now. She made camp in a small cave formed by tumbled boulders at the base of the outcropping. It offered better protection than the previous night's improvised shelter, with solid stone at her back and a narrow entrance that could be monitored. Using the tinderbox, she risked a small fire, just enough to provide warmth as the night air grew chill. In the dancing firelight, Eliza removed her father's pocket watch from her dress. The silver case gleamed dully, the internal mechanism still faithfully marking time, though its ticking was lost to her. Opening it, she traced the inscription inside. The cover, "To Edmund, may time be kind. With love, Margaret." Her mother's words, given on their wedding day. Time had not been kind to Edmund Blackwood. It had taken his wife to consumption, led him westward with dreams of a new start, and delivered him to a violent end on the Arkansas frontier. But within those years, he had loved fiercely, had taught his daughter to navigate a world suddenly rendered silent, had never once treated her deafness as a tragedy, but rather as simply another way of being. Eliza closed the watch, securing it, once more in her pocket. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight she had shelter, a small fire, and memories of being loved. In the vast wilderness, it would have to be enough. Morning light filtered through the cracks between the boulders that had sheltered Eliza through the night. The small fire had died to embers hours ago, leaving only ash and a lingering warmth in the enclosed space. Her body protested as she uncurled from her sleeping position, muscles stiff from days of exertion and nights on unyielding ground. 4 days had passed since the massacre. 4 days of southward travel, of rationing dwindling supplies, of constant vigilance. The wilderness, initially so threatening in its vastness, had gradually revealed its patterns to her observant eyes. She had learned to spot the subtle movement of disturbed underbrush that indicated small game, to recognize the plants that grew near water sources, to read the positioning of moss on tree trunks as a natural compass. Survival was teaching her lessons that no schoolroom ever could. This morning, Eliza faced a grim reality. Her food supplies were nearly exhausted. 2 strips of dried beef remained, along with a handful of dried apples. At her current pace, she estimated another 3 to 4 days of travel before reaching the trading post her father had mentioned. If she could maintain her direction correctly, if such a place still existed, if her strength held, too many ifs. Emerging from her makeshift shelter, Eliza surveyed the surrounding forest with new determination. She would need to supplement her supplies. The knife at her belt was her only tool for hunting, but her father had taught her to fashion simple snares years ago, when they'd still lived on the fringes of the Pennsylvania wilderness. The morning was spent setting 3 crude traps along what appeared to be a rabbit run, using strips torn from the bottom of her petticoat for cordage and green saplings for tension. It was painstaking work, particularly with her limited tools, but necessity drove precision. With the traps set, Eliza continued southward, marking her path so she could return to check the snares. The day had warmed considerably, spring asserting itself against the lingering chill of winter. She removed her woolen shawl, tying it around her waist as she walked. By midday, the terrain began to change subtly. The dense forest thinned in places, giving way to occasional meadows dotted with wildflowers, patches of Indian paintbrush, adding splashes of red among the greens and browns of the landscape. In one such clearing, Eliza spotted a cluster of wild onions, their distinctive strappy leaves immediately recognizable. She harvested them eagerly, securing the small bulbs in her pack. The afternoon brought another stroke of fortune. A wild plum tree in early bloom, with a few fruits from the previous season still clinging to lower branches. Though wrinkled and somewhat fermented, they were edible. Eliza gathered every one she could find, the sweet tart taste a welcome change from dried meat and berries. As she reached for a particularly promising plum, movement at the clearing's edge caught her attention. Freezing in place, she watched as a black bear and her cub emerged from the forest. The animals moved with unhurried purpose toward a patch of early spring berries some 50 yards from where Eliza stood. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she remained absolutely still. Running would only trigger the bear's predatory instinct. Making herself appear large and threatening might protect her from some predators, but not a mother bear protecting her cub. Her only advantage was that the wind blew from the bears toward her. They had not yet caught her scent. For nearly 20 minutes, Eliza remained motionless, watching the bears forage. The mother occasionally raised her head, testing the air, while the cub tumbled playfully between feeding bouts. There was a strange beauty in their movements, a reminder that she was the intruder in their domain. Eventually, the bears ambled back into the forest, disappearing as silently as they had arrived. Eliza released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her legs trembling slightly with the aftermath of fear. She gathered the remaining plums quickly and retreated from the clearing. The encounter had cost her valuable daylight. Shadows lengthened across the forest floor as she made her way back to check her snares. The first 2 traps were undisturbed, but the third held a small rabbit, already still. A pang of regret mingled with necessary relief. This meant at least one substantial meal and perhaps meat she could dry over a fire for the coming days. With practiced efficiency, learned from watching her father prepare game during their journey west, Eliza cleaned the rabbit using her hunting knife. The process was messy without proper tools, but she managed to preserve most of the meat. Building a small fire in a protected hollow, she fashioned a crude spit from green branches and roasted portions of the rabbit, setting aside the rest to smoke overnight. The hot meal renewed her strength and resolve. As darkness settled fully over the forest, Eliza considered her progress. The landscape had been gradually descending over the past 2 days, suggesting she was leaving the higher elevations of the Ozarks. If her navigation was accurate, she might reach the river valley she'd glimpsed from the rocky outcropping within. Another day's journey. That night, sheltered beneath an overhanging rock formation similar to the previous evening's refuge, Eliza allowed herself to consider what lay ahead beyond immediate survival. If she reached a trading post, what then? She had no money, no family, no means of supporting herself. Her skills as a carpenter's daughter might find some use, but a deaf woman alone on the frontier faced prospects more limiting than most. For the first time since the massacre, she permitted herself to weep, not just for her father and the others, who had died, but for the future that had been stolen from her. The tears came silently, as all her expressions did, but they carried a weight of grief that physical exhaustion had kept at bay until now. Dawn arrived with unexpected weather. Low clouds heavy with moisture, a steady drizzle that promised a miserable day of travel. Eliza packed her few belongings, carefully wrapping the smoked rabbit meat in a clean section of her petticoat. The oilcloth that had served as shelter would now become a makeshift cloak against the rain. The day unfolded in a monotonous struggle against the elements. The rain never developed into a true downpour, but its persistent nature ensured she was soon soaked through despite the oilcloth covering. The forest floor turned treacherous, mud clinging to her boots, adding pounds of weight to each step. Twice she slipped, the second fall wrenching her ankle painfully. By midday, Eliza was forced to seek shelter beneath a dense stand of pine trees, where the canopy offered some protection from the relentless drizzle. She removed her boot to examine her ankle, swollen but not severely injured. Still, it would slow her progress considerably. Sitting with her back against a pine trunk, she massaged the injured joint, willing the swelling to subside. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she resisted the urge to dip into her precious meat supplies. Instead, she chewed on a strip of pine bark, its resinous taste unpleasant, but offering some distraction from discomfort. The rain continued throughout the afternoon, forcing Eliza to abandon any hope of substantial progress that day. She used the time to fashion a walking stick from a fallen branch, stripping away smaller twigs and smoothing the wood as best she could with her knife. It would help take pressure off her injured ankle when she resumed travel. As evening approached, a new concern emerged. Her clothes were thoroughly soaked and the temperature was dropping. Without dry garments or material for a substantial fire, she faced the very real danger of a chill that could develop into fever. Hypothermia was as deadly as any predator. Necessity drove innovation. Using her knife, Eliza cut branches from the lower portions of several pine trees, creating a thick bed of boughs beneath the densest part of the canopy. The natural pine resin would help repel some moisture, and the springy branches would lift her body off the saturated ground. Beneath this makeshift shelter, she removed her sodden outer dress, wringing as much water from it as possible before spreading it nearby, in hopes it might dry somewhat overnight. In her damp chemise and petticoat, she huddled beneath the oilcloth, drawing her knees to her chest to conserve body heat. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by shivering and the constant discomfort of dampness. Sometime in the night, the rain finally ceased, but a heavy mist remained, clinging to the forest like a spectral presence. Morning brought marginal improvement. Her ankle's swelling had subsided enough to bear weight, though pain accompanied each step. Her dress remained damp but was wearable, and the walking stick provided welcome support. Most importantly, gaps in the cloud cover suggested the weather might finally clear. Eliza resumed her southward journey with renewed determination. The previous day's setback had consumed precious food supplies with minimal progress to show for it. She needed to reach the river valley to find signs of human habitation before her strength failed completely. By midday, the terrain began a more pronounced descent. The forest thinned further, and through breaks in the trees, Eliza caught glimpses of open land ahead. Her pace quickened, despite her ankle's protest, hope providing energy where physical reserves had all but depleted. Late afternoon brought her to the forest's edge. Before her stretched a valley perhaps 2 miles across, with a river winding through its center like a silver ribbon. The opposite valley wall rose in gentle slopes, covered in mixed woodland. In the far distance, what appeared to be thin columns of smoke rose against the sky, campfires or settlements, impossible to determine at this range. The sight nearly brought Eliza to her knees with relief. Whether the smoke indicated native encampments or settler cabins, it represented human presence, the first she'd encountered since fleeing the massacre site. Getting there, however, presented new challenges. The valley floor lay exposed, offering no cover should hostile eyes be watching. The river would need crossing, its width and depth impossible to gauge from her current position. And the smoke that signaled potential help could just as easily mark danger. There was no way to know. If she approached friend or foe, prudence dictated observation before action. Finding a sheltered position at the forest's edge, Eliza settled in to watch the valley as daylight waned. No obvious movement was visible across the open expanse. No riders, no distant figures that might indicate immediate threat. The smoke. Columns remained steady, suggesting established fires rather than signals or temporary camps. Darkness would provide better cover for her crossing, but navigating unfamiliar terrain at night carried its own risks. After careful consideration, Eliza decided to descend to the valley floor before full darkness, but wait until first light to attempt the river crossing. This would position her closer to her goal, while allowing daylight for the most dangerous portion of the journey. The descent was treacherous in places, the recent rain having loosened soil on the steeper portions of the path. Using her walking stick for balance and occasionally as an anchor, Eliza picked her way carefully down the valley wall. By the time she reached level ground, the sun had disappeared behind the western ridge, though enough light remained to navigate by. Tall grasses, covered much of the valley floor, interspersed with occasional stands of cottonwood trees that marked wetter ground. Eliza moved through this landscape cautiously, constantly scanning for any sign of human presence. She found none, though animal trails suggested deer and possibly larger predators frequented the area. Reaching the riverbank just as true darkness fell, she located a small clearing among a cluster of willows that offered both concealment and access to fresh water. Here she established a modest camp. No fire, despite the chill, but a more comfortable bed of dry grasses gathered from nearby. The river itself flowed steadily, perhaps 30 yards across at this point. Its waters reflected starlight in gentle ripples, suggesting a current that was significant but not overwhelming. Several large stones protruded from the water near the center, potentially offering stepping points for crossing. She would evaluate. Better in daylight. That night, though physical exhaustion should have guaranteed sleep, Eliza found herself unusually alert. Something had changed in her surroundings, some subtle shift in energy that her unconscious mind registered even if she couldn't articulate it. Without hearing to warn her of approaching danger, she relied on instinct, and instinct now urged caution. Twice she thought she detected movement along the far riverbank, though the play of moonlight on water and wind-stirred branches made certainty impossible. Once, what appeared to be a lantern light flickered briefly among the trees across the river, then vanished so quickly she questioned whether she'd actually seen it. Dawn arrived with a ground mist that reduced visibility to mere yards, both blessing and curse. It would provide cover for her river crossing, but make navigation more challenging once she reached the opposite shore. Eliza ate a small portion of rabbit meat, drank deeply from the river, and refilled her canteen. Whatever awaited her across the water, she would need her strength. The mist began to lift as the morning sun strengthened, revealing the river in greater detail. What had appeared to be potential stepping stones by starlight proved less promising in daylight. The gaps between rocks were substantial, the water flowing with more force than it had appeared the previous evening. Eliza tested the water's depth. Near the bank, finding it reached just above her knees, deeper sections would likely reach her waist or higher. Swimming might become necessary, a prospect that filled her with trepidation. Though she could swim, the combination of cold water, current, and the awkwardness of keeping her few possessions dry presented significant challenges. As she contemplated the safest crossing point, movement on the far bank caught her attention. A figure emerged from the tree line, tall, broad-shouldered, distinctly male. Even at this distance, his heritage was apparent in his copper skin and the way he moved through the landscape with innate confidence. A Cherokee hunter, she realized, likely from the nation that lay south of the Ozarks. He carried a rifle slung across his back and appeared to be examining something on the ground. Tracks, perhaps. His attention was focused downward, giving Eliza precious moments to decide her next action. She could retreat to the willows, hoping to remain undetected until he moved on. She could attempt to catch his attention, risk communication despite her inability to hear his response. Or she could simply wait, observe longer before committing to either approach. The decision was made for her when the hunter straightened suddenly, his gaze sweeping across the river directly to where she stood. Their eyes met across the water, a moment of mutual assessment frozen in time. Eliza did not move, did not attempt to flee. Flight would only trigger pursuit. Instead, she straightened to her full height, one hand raised in what she hoped would be interpreted as a peaceful gesture rather than a threat. The hunter remained equally still, though she noted his hand had moved slightly toward the knife at his belt, not drawing it but prepared. After what seemed an eternity, but could only have been seconds, he raised his own hand in the mirror of her gesture. Neither moved for several heartbeats. Then, with deliberate slowness, the hunter pointed to himself, then to the ground beside him, then to Eliza, and finally back to himself. The meaning was clear enough. Stay there. I will come to you. Eliza nodded once, her entire body tense with uncertainty. She had no way to know his intentions. The Cherokee had suffered greatly at the hands of white settlers. What obligation did this man have to show kindness to a lone white woman? Yet running now would only appear suspicious, perhaps hostile. The hunter disappeared into the tree line, re-emerging minutes later upstream where the river narrowed considerably. With practiced efficiency, he crossed at what appeared to be a natural ford, the water barely reaching his knees where it would have been waist-deep at her chosen crossing point. As he approached along the riverbank, Eliza took inventory of what she could observe. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with obsidian eyes that missed nothing. A scar ran along his right jawline, disappearing beneath the collar of his buckskin shirt. His hair was worn longer than white, men's fashion, but bound at the nape of his neck with a leather cord. When he stopped some 10 paces from her, Eliza could see the wariness in his posture, the slight angle of his body that kept his dominant side away from her, the careful positioning of his feet for quick movement if needed. But she also noted that he had not drawn his weapon, had approached openly rather than attempting to circle behind her. The hunter spoke, his lips forming words she couldn't hear but could partially read. A question, she thought, though his Cherokee accent made lip-reading more challenging than it had been with the English speakers she'd grown up among. Eliza touched her ear, then shook her head, tapping her lips before pointing to him. The universal gesture for, "I am deaf. I must read your lips." Understanding registered immediately in the hunter's expression. He nodded once, then spoke again, this time more deliberately, his face turned directly toward her so she could better see his mouth. "You... alone? From... where?" The gaps in her understanding were frustrating, but the general meaning was clear enough. Eliza pointed northward, then held up 5 fingers, followed by a sleeping gesture. 5 days' travel. She mimed shooting, people falling, herself hiding. The simplified communication felt childish, but it conveyed the essential truth. The hunter's expression darkened. He pointed in the same northerly direction, made his own gesture of shooting, then held up 3 fingers before pointing westward. 3 days ago, gunfire to the west. He had heard or perhaps witnessed another attack. Their crude communication continued, information exchanged through gestures, pantomime, and the few words Eliza could confidently read from his lips. His name, she understood, was Siskwa, bird, in the Cherokee language, though he indicated white men called him something else she couldn't quite decipher. Through their exchange, Eliza learned that the smoke columns she'd observed came from a small Cherokee hunting camp, not a permanent settlement. Siskwa had been tracking deer when he discovered her prints along the riverbank, small footprints he recognized as belonging to a white woman, an unusual finding so far from established settlements. When she indicated her desperate need for food, shelter, and eventual transport to a trading post where she might find passage eastward, Siskwa seemed to consider carefully before responding. He pointed to himself, then to Eliza, then toward the hunting camp, following with a gesture that suggested caution or uncertainty. The message was clear enough. He would take her to the camp, but her reception there was not guaranteed to be welcoming. Eliza nodded her understanding. Any risk was preferable to certain death in the wilderness as her supplies dwindled. With a final assessing look, Siskwa gestured for her to follow him upstream to the ford he had used. As they walked, Eliza sensed him watching her limping gait, noting her exhaustion, and the makeshift walking stick that supported her injured ankle. At the river crossing, without warning or request, he offered his arm for support. The gesture, practical rather than chivalrous, nonetheless represented the first human assistance she had received since the massacre. Eliza accepted it with a nod of gratitude, her fingers closing around the solid strength of his forearm as they navigated the slippery rocks of the ford. On the opposite bank, Tsiskwa paused, pointing to her injured ankle with a questioning expression. Eliza shrugged, indicating it was painful but manageable. He seemed unconvinced, studying her face with an intensity that suggested he was reading more than just her words. He was assessing her condition, her determination, perhaps even her trustworthiness. Whatever conclusion he reached remained unspoken, but as they set off toward the distant camp, he adjusted his usual pace to accommodate her slower progress. The simple courtesy spoke volumes in their shared silence. The journey to the Cherokee hunting camp followed a winding path through stands of oak and hickory. Tsiskwa moved with the confidence of one who knew every feature of the landscape, occasionally pausing to indicate something of interest. Medicinal plants, fresh animal tracks, or subtle markers that Eliza suspected were trail signs known only to his people. Despite her exhaustion, Eliza found herself observing her guide with cautious curiosity. Unlike the overly romanticized, noble savages of Eastern newspapers or the bloodthirsty heathens described around settler campfires, Tsiskwa presented a more complex reality. His clothing blended traditional Cherokee elements with items clearly obtained through trade. Buckskin leggings and shirts adorned with geometric patterns, but also a European-style hunting knife sheathed at his belt and boots that, while worn, were of settler manufacture. The morning progressed as they traveled, the sun climbing higher, burning away lingering mist from the valley. Tsiskwa maintained a pace that challenged Eliza's injured ankle, but stopped whenever her limp became more pronounced, allowing brief moments of rest without explicitly acknowledging her weakness. She appreciated this tacit respect. He neither pitied nor ignored her limitations. During one such pause, Tsiskwa knelt beside a plant Eliza didn't recognize, its broad leaves forming a rosette near the ground. He gestured for her to watch as he harvested several leaves, then mimed applying them to his ankle, followed by a gesture suggesting reduced pain. Understanding his intent, Eliza nodded gratefully. Finding a fallen log where she could sit, Tsiskwa indicated she should remove her boot. The ankle beneath was swollen and mottled with bruising. He examined it with clinical detachment, his touch professional rather than personal as he assessed the damage. Seemingly satisfied that the injury was a sprain rather than a break, he crushed the harvested leaves between his palms, working them until they released a green paste with a pungent aroma. Tsiskwa applied this poultice to her ankle, securing it with a strip of cloth torn from the bottom of his own shirt. The cool sensation of the herbal remedy penetrated almost immediately, numbing the worst of the throbbing pain. He pointed to the sun, then to her ankle, followed by a sleeping gesture. The medicine would work better if she stayed off the foot for several hours. Eliza frowned, gesturing toward their presumed destination, then at the sky. Wouldn't stopping jeopardize their chances of reaching the camp before nightfall? Tsiskwa considered briefly, then pointed to himself, made a walking motion, followed by returning motions. He would continue to the camp and return for her, a prospect that filled Eliza with immediate unease. Though he had shown her nothing but consideration thus far, the wilderness held too many dangers for her to consider remaining alone and effectively immobile. Her discomfort must have been evident in her expression. Tsiskwa studied her face, then nodded once in understanding. Instead of leaving her, he began gathering branches and constructing a simple travois, a frame of poles with a sling of woven vines that could be dragged behind him, bearing her weight rather than forcing her to walk on the injured ankle. The ingenuity of the solution impressed Eliza, as did his willingness to expend additional effort rather than simply leave her to fend for herself. When the travois was complete, Tsiskwa helped her onto the crude but effective transport. He then collected her makeshift pack and the walking stick, securing them alongside her before grasping the ends of the poles and resuming their journey. The travois bumped and jostled over uneven ground, but it was vastly preferable to walking. Eliza found herself studying the back of her rescuer as he pulled her through the forest. The broad shoulders that suggested considerable strength, the subtle signals of alertness in the way he held his head, constantly scanning their surroundings. Vulnerability was an uncomfortable position for someone who had spent years developing independence despite her disability. Yet there was something almost peaceful in this enforced surrender to another's care. They traveled for perhaps 2 hours before Cisqua's posture changed subtly. His pace slowed, his movements becoming more deliberate. He paused at the edge of a small clearing, setting down the travois poles before kneeling beside Eliza. His expression was serious as he pointed toward a rise beyond the clearing, then held a finger to his lips. Camp was near, his gesture indicated, but caution was necessary. He helped her to her feet, offering his shoulder for support. Eliza tested her ankle carefully. The herbal remedy had reduced both pain and swelling considerably, making limping possible, but still uncomfortable. Leaning on Cisqua, she followed as he led her through the clearing toward a ridgeline dotted with rock formations. As they crested the hill, the hunting camp came into view below. 5 hide-covered structures arranged in a rough semicircle with 3 central fire pits where cooking and other communal activities clearly took place. Eliza counted 8 individuals moving about the camp, 4 men, 3 women, and a child of perhaps 10 winters. All appeared to be Cherokee, their dark hair and copper skin distinctive even at this distance. Cisqua made a bird call that seemed too perfect to be human, immediately catching the attention of those below. Several looked up, spotting the 2 figures on the ridgeline. Their reactions were immediate. The child was hurried into one of the structures, while 2 of the men reached for weapons. Cisqua raised his hand in what Eliza assumed was a signal of peace or identification. After a moment, the armed men relaxed slightly, though they did not set aside their weapons. One called something that Eliza could not hear, and Cisqua responded with words she could not understand, but a tone that seemed reassuring even without sound. He turned to her, his expression communicating what words could not. They would descend to the camp, but she should stay close to him and make no sudden movements. The reception might not be welcoming, at least initially. The descent was awkward with her injured ankle, but Cisqua's support made it manageable. As they approached the camp, Eliza became acutely aware of the scrutiny directed at her from every pair of eyes. The women's gazes held suspicion, the men's outright hostility. The child peered from the doorway of a dwelling, curiosity overriding caution. An older man stepped forward to meet them as they reached level ground, tall and straight-backed, despite his advanced years, with deep creases lining a face that spoke of both wisdom and hardship. A single eagle feather adorned his silver-streaked hair, and the deference shown by the others identified him as the camp's leader. Cisqua and the elder spoke at length, a conversation Eliza could follow only through their expressions and gestures. Cisqua indicated her several times, pantomimed the attack on the wagon train, and made several gestures toward the north that seemed to reference other incidents or locations significant to their discussion. Throughout the exchange, Eliza stood, as straight as her injured ankle would allow, meeting the elder's evaluating gaze whenever it turned to her. She would not appear weak or frightened, though she was acutely aware of her vulnerability, a lone white woman among people who had every reason to distrust her kind. After what seemed an interminable discussion, the elder approached her directly. His weathered face remained impassive as he studied her, his dark eyes missing nothing, not the exhaustion evident in her posture, the tears and stains on her once respectable dress, nor the resolved set of her jaw despite everything. He spoke, his lips forming words she could partially decipher. "Tsiskwa says you cannot hear." Eliza nodded, touching her ear and shaking her head to confirm. "But you understand lips?" the elder continued, his movements more deliberate as he recognized her means of communication. She nodded again, relief washing through her that he was making an effort to be understood. The elder's next question was direct. Why should Cherokee help white women when white men take Cherokee land? The challenge was fair. Eliza considered her response carefully before raising her hands, pointing to herself, then making a sweeping gesture that encompassed everyone present, followed by a motion of giving and receiving between them. Her meaning was clear. We are, all people, capable of both giving and receiving help, regardless of origin. A flicker of something, approval perhaps, crossed the elder's face before his expression returned to careful neutrality. He turned to the others, speaking words Eliza could not see. Whatever he said resulted in a reluctant lowering of weapons, though wariness remained evident in the postures of all present. Turning back to Eliza, the elder pointed to one of the smaller dwellings at the edge of the camp, then to her. She would be allowed to stay, at least temporarily. With a final assessing look, he walked away, the matter apparently settled for the moment. Tsiskwa led her to the indicated dwelling, a simple structure of poles covered with hides, just tall enough to stand upright in the center. Inside, furs covered the ground, providing insulation from the earth's chill. A small fire pit occupied the center, though no fire burned at present. He gestured for her to sit, then pointed to his own chest. "Adahi," he pronounced carefully, making sure she could see his lips. "Tsiskwa is my Cherokee name, but some call me Adahi." Eliza nodded her understanding, then touched her own chest. "Eliza," she responded, her voice rusty from disuse. "Eliza Blackwood." Adahi repeated her name, his accent reshaping the syllables in a way that wasn't unpleasant. He then touched his ear, shook his head and pointed to her, his expression questioning. How long had she been deaf? Eliza held up both hands, fingers spread, then 2 more fingers. 12 years. She mimed coughing, fever, then touched her ear again. Illness. Adahi nodded his understanding. He pointed to the dwelling's entrance, then to himself, making a returning gesture. He would come back. With that, he ducked through the low doorway, leaving Eliza alone for the first time since their meeting at the riverbank. The solitude offered a moment to process everything that had occurred. From the brink of complete isolation, she had found herself thrust into a community, albeit one where she was clearly an outsider, tolerated rather than welcomed. The reprieve from immediate danger allowed exhaustion to wash over her in waves. Without conscious decision, Eliza stretched out on the furs, her body surrendering to the rest it desperately needed. She woke to a touch on her shoulder. A Cherokee woman knelt beside her, perhaps a few years older than Eliza herself, her expression guarded but not hostile. She offered a wooden bowl containing what appeared to be some kind of stew, the steam rising from it carrying unfamiliar but appetizing aromas. Eliza accepted the food with a grateful nod. The stew contained venison, various roots and herbs she couldn't identify. After days of near starvation, she forced herself to eat slowly, savoring each spoonful of the rich mixture. The woman watched her eat with undisguised curiosity. When Eliza had finished, she returned the bowl with a smile and a gesture of thanks. The woman didn't smile in return, but gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, before taking the empty vessel and departing without further interaction. Left alone again, Eliza examined her surroundings more thoroughly. The dwelling contained few possessions. A rolled bundle that might contain extra furs or clothing, several small pouches hanging from the support poles that likely held herbs or other necessities, and a pair of moccasins too large to belong to a woman. This, she realized, was probably Adahi's own dwelling that he had surrendered for her use. The gesture was unexpectedly thoughtful, adding another layer to her assessment of the Cherokee hunter who had found her by the river. There had been no obligation for him to help her, certainly no expectation that he would give up his own shelter. White settlers would consider such courtesy toward an enemy unusual, yet here was evidence that compassion might transcend the boundaries drawn by conflict. Adahi returned as evening approached, carrying a bundle of what proved to be clothing, a simple deerskin dress, moccasins, and a woven belt. He set these beside her, then pointed to her torn and filthy dress with a practical expression that needed no translation. The Cherokee garments would be more suitable for her current circumstances. He then indicated her ankle, a questioning tilt to his head. Was it improving? Eliza removed the poultice, now dried, to reveal that the swelling had indeed reduced considerably. She demonstrated greater mobility, earning an approving nod from her benefactor. Adahi settled cross-legged near the dwelling's entrance, leaving appropriate distance between them. Using a combination of gestures and carefully formed words, he explained the current situation. The elder, Grey Wolf, had granted her temporary sanctuary, but some in the camp remained suspicious of her presence. The hunting party had been tracking a group of white men who had attacked a Cherokee family traveling to rejoin their clan, killing the father and taking their horses and supplies. The description of these attackers matched what Eliza had conveyed about those who massacred her wagon train. This connection appeared to be the primary reason she had been allowed to stay. She potentially possessed information about enemies of the Cherokee. Adahi made it clear that while he had spoken for her, her continued welcome depended on proving her value to the group. Eliza considered this information carefully. Her position was precarious, her safety contingent on usefulness to people who had every reason to distrust her. Yet the alternative was to face the wilderness alone, with minimal supplies and limited knowledge of survival. The pragmatic choice was clear. Using gestures and the few words she could vocalize clearly enough to be understood, she conveyed her willingness to share everything she knew about the attackers. She also indicated her practical skills. She had learned basic carpentry from her father, and was willing to work in any capacity needed while she recovered her strength. Adahi seemed satisfied with this response. He produced a small leather pouch, extracting a mixture of herbs similar to what he had applied to her ankle earlier. He demonstrated how she should mix this with water to create a fresh poultice for overnight treatment. The care, while practical, rather than personal, nonetheless represented a level of concern Eliza hadn't expected. As dusk deepened into true night, sounds of the camp settling reached her. Voices around fires, the occasional laugh or call, the rhythmic scraping she recognized as someone working a hide. Normal sounds of community that made her ache with remembrance of what she had lost. Adahi rose to leave, pointing to his chest, then making a sleeping gesture while indicating another dwelling. He would sleep elsewhere. Before departing, he placed his hunting knife within her reach, a significant gesture of trust, offering her both protection and acknowledgement of her right to defend herself, if necessary. Left alone, Eliza changed into the deerskin dress, finding it surprisingly comfortable despite its unfamiliar cut. The soft leather moved with her body in a way her cotton dress never had, and the moccasins seemed to cushion her injured ankle more effectively than her worn boots. She applied the fresh poultice, as instructed, then settled onto the furs, her mind reviewing the extraordinary turn her circumstances had taken. From certain death in the wilderness to precarious shelter among people who viewed her with suspicion, it was not safety in any traditional sense, but it offered the first glimmer of hope she'd known since watching her father fall. Outside, a flute began to play, a haunting melody that vibrated in the still night air. Though Eliza couldn't hear the notes, she could feel their resonance, a reminder that music existed in forms beyond audible sound. As she drifted towards sleep, her hand closed around her father's pocket watch, the familiar shape a talisman connecting past to uncertain future. Morning arrived with renewed activity in the camp. Eliza woke to find a water skin and a small bundle containing dried meat and berries placed just inside the dwelling's entrance, breakfast left by an unseen hand. After eating and testing her ankle, much improved but still tender, she emerged cautiously into the daylight. The camp operated with efficient purpose, women tending fires and preparing hides, men maintaining weapons or planning the day's hunting, the child helping with various tasks under the watchful eye of an elderly woman. Eliza's appearance generated immediate attention, conversations pausing as all eyes turned to evaluate the stranger among them. Adahi approached from where he had been conferring with two other hunters. He indicated she should follow him to where. Grey Wolf sat outside the largest dwelling, smoking a long pipe and observing the camp's activities. The elder acknowledged their approach with a slight nod, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. What followed was a more formal introduction than the previous day's brief exchange. Grey Wolf's words, carefully formed for her benefit, established the conditions of her stay. She would work alongside the women, share what she knew of the attackers, and remain under Adahi's direct supervision. Any attempt to leave without permission or signal to passing whites would be considered an act of betrayal with severe consequences. The terms were stern but fair, given the circumstances. Eliza nodded her acceptance, understanding that trust would have to be earned slowly, if at all. Grey Wolf studied her face for any sign of deception, then gestured toward a woman working at one of the fires. Nuna, Adahi explained, would show Eliza her duties. As she followed Adahi toward Nuna, Eliza caught the open hostility in some gazes, particularly from a younger hunter whose scarred face suggested previous violent encounters with whites. Others showed mere indifference, and one or two, including the child and the elderly woman, displayed cautious curiosity. Nuna proved to be the same woman who had brought food the previous evening. Up close, Eliza noticed details previously. Mist, a faded scar along her hairline, eyes that held shadows of past sorrows, capable hands that never stopped moving. She demonstrated tasks with brisk efficiency, grinding corn, preparing hides for tanning, weaving reeds into baskets. Eliza applied herself to these unfamiliar tasks with determined focus. Each successful completion represented another small step toward acceptance, another moment of continued survival. Adahi checked on her periodically throughout the morning, his expression gradually shifting from concern to something resembling approval as he observed her willingness to work despite her still healing ankle. By midday, a tentative rhythm had been established. Eliza's initial awkwardness with the unfamiliar tasks generated a few reluctant smiles from Nuna, who proved to be a patient, if reserved, teacher. The child, a boy named Warrior, gradually ventured closer, fascination with the deaf white woman overcoming caution. It was Warrior who first attempted real communication beyond necessity. Approaching while Eliza took a brief rest, he pointed to various objects, then formed the Cherokee words for them with exaggerated clarity. A teaching game, she realized, and one that offered mutual benefit. He learned about her strange condition while she gained vocabulary in his language. Adahi, returning from a scouting expedition, discovered them thus engaged. His expression as he watched the impromptu language lesson contained something new, a softening around the eyes, perhaps recognition of something unexpected in this strange alliance of circumstance. When Warrior was called away by his grandmother, Adahi settled beside Eliza in the shade of a tall oak at the camp's edge. For several minutes, He simply observed as she continued working on a partially completed basket Nuna had given her. Then, with deliberate movements, he began to communicate something more complex than their previous exchanges had allowed. "Bacha, hunting party," he explained through gestures and carefully formed words, would depart the next day to track the men who had attacked both the Cherokee family and Eliza's wagon train. His hands shaped the terrain they would cover, indicated the direction of travel, and demonstrated the caution they would exercise when approaching the suspected camp of these raiders. Eliza watched intently, understanding dawning. This wasn't merely information, it was an invitation. Adahi was asking, in his way, if she could identify these men with certainty, if she saw them from a safe distance. Her knowledge of the attackers made her potentially valuable to their mission. The prospect filled her with conflicting emotions: fear at the thought of seeing those men again, satisfaction at the possibility of justice, uncertainty about her place in this unfolding Cherokee response to violence against their people. But beneath these surface reactions lay a deeper recognition. She was being offered a chance to transform from burden to asset, from outsider to participant. Eliza nodded. Slowly, her expression resolute. She pointed to the distinctive bandana Adahi wore, then to her eyes, followed by a gesture mimicking the red-haired leader of the attackers. Yes, she could identify them, particularly the man with the red hair who had directed the massacre. Adahi studied her face, perhaps seeking any sign of deception or weakness. Finding none, he nodded once. Decision made. She would accompany them tomorrow, her eyes providing confirmation that might prevent mistakes in dispensing justice. As he rose to share this development with Grey Wolf, Eliza realized that in less than a day, her status in the camp had evolved from suspicious intruder to potential ally. It was a precarious position contingent on proving her value, but it represented a path forward where before there had been none. The remainder of the day passed in preparation. Weapons were checked and readied, provisions packed, strategies discussed among the men, while the women ensured the camp could function during their absence. Through it all, Eliza continued her assigned tasks, acutely aware of the shifting attitudes around her as word spread of her inclusion in tomorrow's expedition. Some clearly disapproved, particularly the scarred hunter, whose name she learned was Akule. Others seemed cautiously supportive, recognizing the practical advantage her identification skills might provide. Grey Wolf himself revealed nothing of his thoughts, though he watched her with increased intensity as evening approached. That night, as the camp gathered around the central fire for the evening meal, Eliza found herself included in the circle rather than segregated at its edge. The placement was symbolic but significant, a tenuous acknowledgement of potential belonging that felt momentous after days of total isolation. Adahi sat nearby, occasionally translating key parts of conversations when he noticed her struggle to follow the rapid exchanges. In these small considerations, Eliza glimpsed something beyond mere pragmatism, a recognition of her humanity that transcended the boundaries of language, culture, and historical enmity. As darkness settled fully over the camp and plans for the morning's departure were finalized, Eliza realized that in less than a week her world had been destroyed, reordered, and now pointed toward an unpredictable future where former enemies might become allies in a shared pursuit of justice. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, but for the first time since watching her father fall, she would not face them alone. Dawn broke with muted colors, the rising sun obscured by a blanket of clouds that promised rain before day's end. The hunting camp stirred earlier than usual, preparations for the tracking expedition already underway when Eliza emerged from her borrowed dwelling. Adahi approached, carrying a bundle that proved to contain softened leather leggings, more practical for travel than the dress alone. and a water skin freshly filled. His expression was serious as he assessed her readiness, paying particular attention to her injured ankle. Though still tender, it bore weight without significant pain, the Cherokee herbal remedies having worked with remarkable effectiveness. The tracking party consisted of 4 men: Adahi, Grey Wolf, despite his advanced years, a middle-aged hunter called Tsi, whose skill with a bow was apparently legendary, and the scarred warrior Akul, whose opposition to Eliza's presence remained evident in his rigid posture and averted gaze. The small size of the group surprised her. She had expected more warriors for a potentially dangerous confrontation. Grey Wolf seemed to read her thoughts, addressing her with the careful enunciation that had become his habit when communicating with her. Small group moves quietly. His lips formed. Many feet, many sounds. The wisdom was undeniable. This was a tracking mission first, one that required stealth over strength. Confirmation of the bandits' location and activities would precede any consideration of direct confrontation. Before departing, each member of the party received a small pouch from the elderly woman Eliza had seen with Warrior. Medicine bundles, Adahi explained with gestures, protection for the journey. When the woman approached Eliza, hesitation briefly crossed her lined face before resolving into determination. She pressed a bundle into Eliza's palm, her gnarled fingers closing Eliza's hand around it with surprising strength. Nuna approached as well, offering a small packet of dried meat and corn cakes. The provisions were practical, but the way she met Eliza's eyes suggested something beyond mere utility, a tentative acknowledgement of shared womanhood despite the cultural divide between them. The tracking party departed as the camp settled into its daily routine, following a game trail that led west through increasingly dense forest. Adahi took the lead, with Grey Wolf and Tsi following. Egule positioned himself behind Eliza, a placement that initially made her shoulder blades tingle with awareness until she realized the logic. If she attempted to flee or signal others, he would be immediately aware. The pace was steady, but not punishing, considerate of both Grey Wolf's age and Eliza's healing ankle. They moved with a fluid efficiency that spoke of lifetimes spent navigating woodland terrain, their progress nearly silent, despite the carpet of last autumn's leaves underfoot. Eliza did her best to match their stealth, though her settler's upbringing had never emphasized moving unheard through forests. By mid-morning, the group had covered significant ground, pausing only briefly at a small stream to replenish water. Skins. Adahi used these moments to check Eliza's well-being, his gaze assessing rather than sympathetic. She appreciated this approach. No pity, only practical evaluation of her capacity to continue. Their path gradually angled southwest, following. Signs invisible to Eliza's untrained eye, but apparently clear to her Cherokee companions. Occasionally, Adahi would point out what they were tracking. A broken twig here, displaced moss there, the faint impression of a shod horse's hoof in a patch of soft earth. Slowly, Eliza began to discern these subtle markers, her awareness expanding. Under his silent tutelage, Grey Wolf moved to walk beside her for a time, his lined face turned toward her to enable lip-reading. "Your eyes," he observed, "they see differently." Eliza tilted her head questioningly. "Those who hear," he clarified, "their eyes often sleep." "Your eyes, always watching, good for tracking." The observation startled her with its insight. Her deafness had indeed trained her to observe what others might miss, to read the visual world with heightened attention. What she had always considered a compensation for loss, Grey Wolf recognized as a unique strength. As they continued through the afternoon, the sky darkened further, the promised rain beginning as a gentle mist that gradually intensified. Visibility diminished, and Eliza worried they would lose whatever trail they followed. But the Cherokee, Trackers pressed on, unperturbed, their focus unwavering despite the increasingly adverse conditions. It was Akule who first signaled for a stop, his hand raised sharply as he dropped into a crouch. The others immediately followed suit, Adahi pulling Eliza down beside him with gentle urgency. For several minutes they remained motionless, scanning the rain-shrouded forest ahead. Then Eliza saw what had alerted Akule. Movement through the trees, the unmistakable silhouette of a horse and rider moving perpendicular to their path about 100 yards ahead. The bandit wore a rain-slicked coat and slouch hat, a rifle across his saddlebow. Even at this distance, something in his posture triggered recognition, one of the men from the wagon train attack, though not the red-haired leader. Adahi touched her arm, his expression questioning. Eliza nodded once, confirming the identification. She pointed to her eye, then held up 5 fingers before closing her hand into a fist and reopening it with 3 fingers extended. 8 men, she was indicating, the number she had clearly seen during the massacre. Grey Wolf and Adahi exchanged glances laden with meaning, a silent communication that resulted in a decision. Rather than continuing to follow the trail, they would track this lone rider who might lead them directly to the bandits' camp. The new pursuit required even greater stealth, maintaining enough distance to remain undetected while not losing sight of their quarry through the rain and trees. They moved in single file, Adahi leading, followed by Eliza, then Grey Wolf, with Siyi and Akule bringing up the rear. The formation kept Eliza within protective reach, while positioning the most skilled. Trackers at front and back. For nearly an hour, they shadowed the horseman as he followed a winding path through the forest. Twice, they nearly lost him in the increasing downpour, only to catch glimpses of movement that allowed them to adjust their course. The rain, while complicating their tracking, also provided cover, their footsteps muffled by the steady patter on leaves, their outlines blurred by sheets of water cascading from the canopy above. The bandit eventually led them to the edge of a clearing where a crude camp had been established. From their vantage point among the dripping underbrush, Eliza counted 6 men and 8 horses around 3 canvas shelters strung between trees. Equipment and supplies were scattered about, much of it recognizable as items taken from the wagon train. The Petersons' distinctive trunk, Mr. Hargrove's saddle, canvas bundles that likely contained plundered clothing and provisions. Most significantly, she spotted the red-haired man she had identified as the leader, distinguishable by his height and the way the others deferred to him. Jackson, she had heard him called during the attack. He stood beneath one of the canvas awnings, examining what appeared to be a map spread on a makeshift table, seemingly unbothered by the brutal acts that had secured his current possessions. Eliza's heart pounded against her ribs, fear and rage, intermingling at the sight of the man who had ordered her father's death. Her fingers dug into the soft earth beneath her, grounding her against the surge of emotion that threatened her composure. Adahi's hand closed over hers, a steadying touch that drew her attention away from the traumatic vision. His dark eyes held hers, communicating a clear message: control, focus, survive. They were outnumbered, and this was a reconnaissance mission, not an attack. Her identification had confirmed what they needed to know. These were indeed the men responsible for both the wagon train massacre and the attack on the Cherokee family. Grey Wolf signaled for them to withdraw, retreating deeper into the forest to confer out of sight of the bandits' camp. Once they had established a safe distance, the Cherokee men formed a small circle, discussing strategy with rapid gestures and expressions Eliza struggled to follow. Adahi occasionally translated key points, ensuring she remained informed. The bandits were clearly established as a raiding party, using the isolated clearing as a base for attacking both settlers and natives. Their position was well chosen, near enough to travel routes to provide targets but remote enough to avoid casual discovery. Most concerning was their evident preparation for another raid. Maps, cleaned weapons, and packed supplies suggested imminent action. Whether their target would be Cherokee or settler remained unknown, but neither possibility could be permitted. After the bloodshed they had already caused, Grey Wolf's decision came after careful consideration. They would return to the hunting camp immediately to gather more warriors. A direct confrontation with 6 well-armed bandits required greater numbers than their small tracking party provided. Timing was critical. They needed to return and mount a proper response before the raiders struck again. Darkness was falling as they began the journey back, now moving at a more urgent pace despite the continuing rain and treacherous footing. Eliza struggled to maintain the necessary speed, her ankle protesting the renewed strain, but she pressed on without complaint. Every moment mattered if they were to prevent another massacre like the one that had claimed her father and the entire Hargrove wagon train. Night travel through the forest presented new challenges, particularly for Eliza, who lacked the lifetime of experience that enabled her Cherokee companions to navigate by the faintest light. Adahi solved this problem by having her grasp the leather fringe of his shirt, allowing him to guide her progress without need for constant visual communication. They paused only once during the night journey, when Grey Wolf's stamina required a brief rest. Huddled beneath a large maple that provided some shelter from the persistent rain, they shared the provisions Nuna had provided. The simple act of breaking bread together in the darkness of a forest while pursuing justice created an unspoken bond. No longer simply captive and captors, they had become allies of necessity. As they prepared to resume travel, Akule approached Eliza directly for the first time. His scarred face remained stern, but something had shifted in his regard. He offered her a strip of soft leather, demonstrating how she should bind her ankle more tightly to provide support for the remainder of their journey. The gesture wasn't friendship, but it was acknowledgement, recognition that her identification of the bandits had validated her usefulness to their cause. Dawn was breaking through dissipating rain clouds when they reached the hunting camp, their return causing immediate stir among those who had risen early. Warrior spotted them first, running to spread word of their arrival. Women emerged from dwellings, men gathered from morning tasks, all converging to hear the results of their expedition. Grey Wolf called a council immediately, not even pausing to dry his rain-soaked garments. The urgency transmitted instantly to the others, who gathered in the central clearing where decisions affecting the entire group were traditionally made. Eliza found herself included in this circle, positioned between Adahi and Nuna, who had silently offered a blanket to replace her wet outer garments. The gesture of inclusion was significant. Her status had evolved from outsider to contributor, her insights now valued enough to warrant a place in their deliberations. The council proceeded with rapid exchanges Eliza struggled to follow. The mixture of Cherokee language and quick gestures creating a narrative she could grasp only in fragments. Adahi periodically summarized key points, ensuring she understood the critical elements of the developing plan. The bandits' camp had been located approximately 4 hours' journey southwest, close enough for a coordinated approach before their next raid could be launched. 8 warriors would be assembled, including those from the tracking party except for Grey Wolf, whose age made him more valuable as a strategist than a fighter. They would depart within 2 hours, hoping to reach the bandits' position by mid-afternoon. Eliza's role would be to remain at the hunting camp, having already fulfilled her purpose by confirming the raiders' identities. This decision she understood. Pragmatically, she was neither trained for combat nor physically conditioned for battle. Yet as the planning continued, she found herself increasingly troubled by the prospect of waiting passively while others confronted the men who had destroyed her world. When a pause came in the rapid exchanges, Eliza rose to her feet, drawing all eyes to her unexpected movement. With deliberate gestures, she conveyed her request to accompany the war party, not to fight, but to observe from a safe distance. These men had killed her father, murdered her friends and traveling companions. Justice, when it comes, should have a witness from both peoples wronged by their actions. Her request generated immediate debate, expressions and gestures, communicating clear disagreement among the council members. Akule opposed vigorously, his scarred face contorted with disbelief at what he clearly viewed as absurd presumption. Tsi and several others appeared similarly skeptical, yet Adahi remained thoughtful, his gaze evaluating rather than dismissing her plea. It was Grey Wolf who ultimately responded, his weathered face impassive as he studied her. "Why?" His lips formed the simple question, "Why risk your life to watch?" Eliza considered carefully before responding. She pointed to her eyes, then to her heart, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the entire camp. Some things needed to be witnessed, to be carried forward in memory. Some truths required testimony from all sides of a conflict. The elder's expression remained unreadable as he contemplated her answer. Finally, he nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement that nonetheless settled the matter. She would be permitted to accompany them to a position of relative safety, close enough to observe but removed from direct danger. Preparations began immediately, the camp transforming into disciplined activity. Warriors checked weapons and gathered supplies, while women prepared traveling provisions and medicines for potential injuries. Eliza found herself included in these preparations, Nuna showing her how to pack herbal remedies that might be needed after the confrontation. Adahi approached, as she was securing these supplies in a small deerskin pouch. His expression was serious, his movements deliberate, as he explained the conditions of her accompaniment. She would remain with Woya's grandmother, Amma, at a designated position well away from the fighting. She would follow instructions without question or hesitation. Most importantly, regardless of what she witnessed, she would not intervene or reveal her position, even if the battle turned against the Cherokee warriors. Eliza nodded her understanding and agreement. She had no delusions of heroism or combat prowess. Her presence was as witness, not warrior, yet the gravity of Adahi's instructions underscored the risk inherent in even this limited participation. These bandits had already demonstrated their willingness to slaughter without mercy. They would show no quarter to a Cherokee war party or those associated with them. As final preparations were completed, Eliza found herself standing slightly apart, watching the coordinated efficiency of people whose survival had long depended on such collective action. Her gaze was drawn to Adahi, who moved with quiet authority among the other warriors, checking weapons and conferring on strategy. In the span of days, this man had transformed in her perception from potential threat to unlikely ally. Amma approached, her lined face solemn as she handed Eliza a small carved token, a wooden bird, its wings spread in flight. She closed Eliza's fingers around it with a firm grip, then touched her own heart and pointed to the sky. A protection charm, Eliza realized, offered with genuine concern for her safety. The gesture triggered unexpected emotion. This woman, whose people had suffered generations of betrayal and displacement at the hands of white settlers, was offering spiritual protection to a lone white woman. The complexity of human connection, its capacity to transcend historical enmity in moments of shared purpose, struck Eliza with sudden clarity. The war party departed at mid-morning, moving in single file through the forest with Adahi in the lead. 8 warriors, Amma and Eliza, a small force to confront men whose violence had already claimed dozens of lives. Yet there was confidence in their movements, the assurance of those who knew both terrain and strategy intimately. they traveled. In silence, communication limited to occasional hand signals. Eliza focused on matching the stealth of those ahead of her, placing her feet as they did, avoiding branches that might snap underfoot. Her ankle, though still tender, held firm with the supportive binding Akul had shown her. The journey passed, without incident, the forest revealing neither additional bandits nor other travelers. By early afternoon, they reached a position approximately half a mile from the raiders' camp. Here, Adahi directed Eliza and Amma to establish their observation post, a densely wooded hillock that offered limited visibility of the clearing while providing good cover and a swift retreat path if necessary. As the warriors prepared for their approach, Adahi took a moment to ensure Eliza understood her role. His hands shaped clear instructions: remain hidden, do not move regardless of what transpired, retreat with Amma if a specific bird call signaled danger approaching their position. His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that communicated what words could not. This was not merely tactical instruction, but genuine concern for her safety. Eliza nodded her understanding, then impulsively reached for his hand, pressing the wooden bird charm Amma had given her into his palm. Protection should go to those facing greatest danger. The gesture appeared to surprise him, his expression momentarily unguarded before returning to the focused intensity required by their mission. Without further exchange, Adahi rejoined the other warriors. They moved off in pairs, circling to approach the bandits' camp from multiple directions. Soon they had vanished among the trees, leaving Eliza and Amma alone on their wooded vantage point. From their position, the bandits' camp was partially visible through gaps in the foliage. Eliza could make out the canvas shelters, the horses tethered nearby, occasional movements as men went about their activities. The red-haired leader appeared briefly, issuing what appeared to be instructions to two of his men who nodded and began checking their weapons. Beside her, Amma remained motionless, her aged eyes missing nothing as she surveyed the scene below. Despite her years, there was nothing frail about her presence. She exuded the quiet strength of one who had witnessed both tragedy and triumph throughout a long life. Time passed with excruciating slowness as they waited for the Cherokee warriors to complete their encirclement of the camp. Eliza's every sense strained to compensate for her inability to hear, her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of the approaching confrontation. The attack, when it came, erupted with simultaneous precision. From multiple directions, one moment the bandits were engaged in ordinary camp activities. The next, chaos consumed the clearing. Eliza couldn't hear the war cries or gunshots, but she could see their effects. Men diving for cover, reaching for weapons, horses rearing in panic as arrows found targets with deadly accuracy. The red-haired leader reacted with practiced speed, barking orders as he took position behind an overturned table, rifle raised. Two of his men were already down, one with an arrow protruding from his chest, another clutching his throat as he fell. The remaining bandits returned fire, the muzzle flashes of their weapons visible even through the filtering branches. Eliza's fingers dug into the earth beneath her as she watched the violent tableau unfold. This was justice in its most primal form, not the ordered proceedings of a courtroom, but the direct retribution of those wronged beyond endurance. She searched the chaotic scene for Adahi, finally spotting him as he moved with fluid grace between trees at the clearing's edge, bow drawn, his focus absolute. The battle seemed to both stretch endlessly and pass in an instant. One by one, the bandits fell, some to arrows, others to tomahawks wielded in close combat as the Cherokee warriors pressed their advantage. Through it all, Eliza remained fixed on the red-haired leader, the architect of so much suffering. He fought with the desperate ferocity of a cornered predator, his rifle claiming one Cherokee warrior before he was forced to switch to his sidearm. Then Adahi appeared at the edge of the leader's peripheral vision, moving with purpose toward this final target. The bandit swung his pistol toward this new threat, finger tightening on the trigger. Eliza's breath caught in her throat, a silent scream forming as she watched the weapon level at Ade's chest. But before the pistol could discharge, an arrow struck the bandit's shoulder from another direction, a coolie's shot, perfectly placed to spoil his aim without delivering an immediately fatal wound. The bullet went wide, and in the critical moment that followed, Adahi closed the distance between them. What passed between the Cherokee hunter and the red-haired bandit leader in those final moments, Eliza could not hear. Words were exchanged. That much was clear from their expressions. Recognition, perhaps, or the acknowledgement that violence begets violence on the frontier where justice had no formal arbiters. The end came swiftly after that. As the dust settled over the clearing, only the Cherokee warriors remained standing, though two had sustained injuries, one a bullet graze along the ribs, another a more serious wound to the thigh that his companions were already treating. Amma touched Eliza's arm, signaling it was time to descend to the clearing. The danger had passed, the time for witness had transformed to a time for reckoning. Together they made their way down the hillside, approaching the scene of justice delivered through blood. The aftermath of battle carried its own solemn choreography. As Eliza and Amma reached the clearing, the Cherokee warriors moved with practiced efficiency, treating wounds, securing weapons, and taking stock of what had been recovered from the bandits' camp. No celebration marked their victory, only the quiet acknowledgement of necessary justice completed. Eliza paused at the edge of the clearing, her gaze drawn inexorably to the fallen form of the red-haired leader. In death, Jackson appeared smaller somehow, the menace that had dominated her nightmares reduced to still flesh and spilled blood. She had expected to feel triumph, perhaps even joy, at witnessing his demise. Instead, a complex tangle of emotions washed through her, relief primarily, but also a peculiar emptiness. Vengeance, she discovered, filled no void left by loss. Adahi approached, his expression solemn as he studied her face. Blood spattered his buckskin shirt, not his own, she noted with relief. His dark eyes held a question as he extended his hand, palm up, revealing the wooden bird charm she had given him before the battle. Eliza shook her head, closing his fingers back around the token. A gift, freely given, was not meant for return. Something shifted in his expression at this, a subtle softening around the eyes, perhaps recognition of the gesture's significance beyond mere superstition. The warriors had begun gathering the bandits' supplies, weapons, ammunition, provisions, and the plundered goods from previous raids. Akule discovered a lockbox beneath Jackson's bedroll, forcing it open to reveal a substantial cache of gold coins and paper currency. Blood money, earned through terror and murder. Grey Wolf, who had arrived at the clearing shortly after the fighting, examined these recovered items with measured consideration. Through Adahi's translation, he explained his decision. Goods clearly identifiable as belonging to Cherokee victims would return to their families or remain with the tribe. Items taken from settlers would be divided, some retained as fair compensation for Cherokee losses, the remainder delivered to the nearest territorial authority, along with information about the bandits' activities. This balanced approach to the spoils surprised Eliza. She had perhaps expected the Cherokee to claim everything as a rightful prize, yet Grey Wolf's decision reflected a more nuanced view of justice than she had been raised to expect from savages. His wisdom extended beyond tribal interests to consider the broader implications for peace between peoples who shared contested lands. Among the recovered items, Eliza spotted a familiar object, her father's toolbox, its distinctive maple inlay, unmistakable even at a distance. Her breath caught as Tsi lifted it from among the plunder, examining the finely crafted carpentry tools inside with appreciative hands. Adahi noticed her reaction, following her gaze to the toolbox. Without hesitation, he spoke to Grey Wolf, gesturing toward Eliza and the tools. The elder considered briefly before nodding his agreement. She, though clearly reluctant to part with such quality implements, brought the box to Eliza, setting it carefully at her feet. The weight of it in her hands, this tangible connection to her father, to her life before the massacre, nearly undid her composure. These were the tools Edmund Blackwood had used to build their home in Pennsylvania, to craft furniture for neighbors, to teach his daughter the satisfaction of creating something enduring with one's hands. Their return represented more than recovered property. They were a thread connecting past to whatever future might now unfold. As daylight began to fade, the Cherokee prepared for their departure. The bandits' bodies were left where they had fallen. No burial, no ceremony, simply returned to the earth that would reclaim them in its own time. It was a stark but fitting end for men who had shown no mercy to their victims. The journey back to the hunting camp proceeded more slowly than their earlier approach, burdened now with recovered supplies and wounded warriors. Darkness had fallen completely by the time they reached the outskirts of the camp, where anxious faces awaited their return. Word of their success spread quickly, relief evident in the expressions of those who had feared losing more loved ones. To the bandits' violence. The wounded were immediately tended by women skilled in healing arts, using poultices and herbal remedies similar to those that had hastened Eliza's ankle's recovery. That night, a council fire burned at the center of the camp. Unlike previous gatherings where Eliza had been peripheral, tonight she was given a place of honor beside Grey Wolf, as each warrior recounted the day's events for those who had remained. Behind, though she couldn't hear the words, the expressions and gestures painted a clear narrative of the confrontation and its resolution. When the recounting reached the final moments, Akule's precise arrow that had prevented Jackson from shooting, Adai, and the Cherokee hunter's subsequent confrontation with the bandit leader, all eyes turned briefly to Eliza. Her presence as witness lent additional weight to their account, her very survival testimony to both the bandits' brutality and their ultimate defeat. As the council concluded, Grey Wolf rose to make a final pronouncement. Though Eliza couldn't fully follow his words, Adahi translated the essence. With the immediate threat eliminated, the hunting camp would return to their main village within 2 days. There, a proper ceremony would honor the warrior who had been lost and celebrate those who had returned victorious. Most significantly for Eliza, Grey Wolf declared that she had earned the right to travel with them, no longer as captive or even guest, but as one who had shared both their suffering and their justice. The decision was not without dissenters. Akule and several others maintained reserved expressions, but it represented a remarkable transition from her initial precarious position. Later, as the camp settled into sleep, Eliza sat alone by one of the smaller fires, her father's toolbox open before her. Each tool carried memories, the smooth-worn handles shaped by his hands, the carefully maintained edges that reflected his meticulousness, the faint initials EB etched into each piece. She ran her fingers along them, a tactile connection to the man who had taught her to navigate a silent world with courage and dignity. A shadow fell across the tools, and she looked up to find Adai standing nearby. He gestured to the space beside her, asking permission to join. When she nodded, he settled cross-legged on the ground, his attention drawn to the craftsmanship of the tools displayed between them. With careful movements, he lifted a finely made chisel, examining its balance and edge before returning it respectfully to its place. The appreciation in his eyes spoke of recognition, one craftsman acknowledging the skill of another across cultural boundaries. "Your father made these?" he asked, his lips forming the words with the deliberate clarity that had become his habit. When speaking to her, Eliza nodded, then mimed using the tools to shape wood, followed by indicating various heights. showing how her father had taught her to use them from childhood. Adai's expression registered surprise, quickly followed by genuine interest. He pointed to her, then to the tools, his eyebrows raised in question. Did she possess her father's skills? In answer, Eliza selected a small block of pine from the toolbox, a practice piece her father had always carried for demonstrating techniques or testing edge sharpness. With deft movements, she began shaping it with a small carving knife, her hands remembering patterns practiced countless times during quiet evenings in their Pennsylvania home. Adai watched in silence as a small bird gradually emerged from the wooden block, not elaborate or perfect, but recognizable and imbued with a sense of movement. When she finished, she offered it to him, a more personal return of the wooden bird charm Amma had given her. He accepted the carving with a nod that conveyed more than casual thanks, turning it over in his hands to examine the details before carefully tucking it into the pouch at his belt. Then, with movements that seemed almost hesitant, unusual for one normally so decisive, he began to communicate something more complex than their usual exchanges had allowed. Tomorrow they would begin preparations for the journey to the main village, a 3-day travel east toward the Arkansas River, where most of their band dwelled in more permanent structures. There, life would be different from the hunting camp. More people, established routines, greater scrutiny of the unusual white woman in their midst. As he described this village, Adai's expressions and gestures painted a picture of community, life, children learning tribal ways, elders passing down stories, the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest adapted from ancestral practices. It was not the nomadic existence white settlers often imagined, but a settled life with its own sophistication. What awaited Eliza there remained uncertain. Some would welcome her for her role in bringing justice to those who had attacked Cherokee families. Others would view her with suspicion simply for her race. Much would depend on how she conducted herself, on her willingness to learn their ways while offering skills of value to the community. The complexity of this future hung between them, acknowledged but unresolved as the fire burned low. Finally, Adai rose to leave, pausing only to indicate the toolbox with a gesture that suggested both question and possibility. Perhaps his expression seemed to say these tools represented not just memory, but opportunity, a bridge between her past skills and future purpose. Alone again, Eliza considered the implications of Grey Wolf's decision and Adai's descriptions of village life. The path ahead was not one she had chosen or anticipated, yet it offered something precious, the chance to belong somewhere after having lost everything. Whether that belonging could ever be complete, whether a deaf white woman could truly find place among the Cherokee, remained to be seen. But the alternative, returning to white settlements where she had no family, no resources, and little protection, held less promise than it once might have. Morning brought renewed activity as the hunting camp began dismantling temporary structures and preparing for the journey to the main village. Eliza joined the women in these tasks, her movements now familiar with practices she had observed and participated in during her days among them. Nuna worked alongside her, their initial wariness having evolved into a functional partnership, if not quite friendship. Midday found her helping pack the recovered items from the bandits' camp, organizing them for transport on the extra horses they had acquired in the confrontation. Among these supplies, she discovered a leather-bound book, a ledger with entries detailing the bandits' activities over months. Names, dates, locations of attacks, inventories of plunder, and distributions of profits were recorded in a surprisingly meticulous hand. The document represented potentially valuable evidence should territorial authorities ever investigate the disappearance of the Hargrove wagon train or other victims. Eliza brought it immediately to Grey Wolf, whose expression grew thoughtful as he examined the pages she indicated. Through Adai's translation, the elder acknowledged the ledger's significance, but raised a practical concern. Cherokee testimony carried little weight with white authorities. The book alone might be dismissed as fabricated evidence. For justice to be fully recognized by settler society, a white witness would need to present these findings. Eliza understood his meaning immediately. Her unique position, survivor of the massacre, witness to the bandits' defeat, and now temporary member of the Cherokee community, created both opportunity and responsibility. She could potentially serve as bridge between worlds, carrying truth where Cherokee voices alone might be ignored. The realization settled over her with the weight of unexpected purpose. Her survival, which had initially seemed mere cruel chance, spared by the silence that had often felt like burden, now revealed its potential meaning. Perhaps she had been preserved not just to witness justice, but to ensure its recognition beyond tribal boundaries. Grey Wolf watched her face as understanding dawned, his weathered features revealing approval at her quick comprehension. The ledger was carefully wrapped and added to the items she would personally transport. Its eventual presentation to appropriate authorities would require careful timing and consideration, but its preservation represented a commitment to a more complete justice than mere vengeance had provided. As preparations for departure neared completion, Warrior sought Eliza out, bringing a small gift, a leather pouch decorated with geometric patterns similar to those on the clothing she now wore. The boy demonstrated how it could be secured at her belt, then proudly showed her his own, which contained various small treasures collected during their stay in the hunting camp. The gesture touched her deeply. Children often reflected their community's true attitudes more honestly than adults, and Warrior's friendly overture suggested that at least some in the Cherokee village might welcome rather than merely tolerate her presence. By late afternoon, the hunting camp had been dismantled, its temporary structures returned to nature so thoroughly that little evidence remained of human habitation. Grey Wolf led a brief ceremony before departure, a thanksgiving to the land that had provided shelter and sustenance, a promise to return when seasons turned again. Eliza observed this ritual with growing appreciation for the relationship between the Cherokee and the natural world, not the primitive superstition portrayed in settler accounts, but a sophisticated acknowledgement of human dependence on forces greater than themselves. Her own Presbyterian upbringing had emphasized dominion over nature rather than partnership with it. The contrast prompted reflections on how different cultural lenses shaped one's perception of the same world. Their journey eastward began as the sun dipped toward the horizon, taking advantage of cooler evening hours for the initial stage of travel. Eliza rode one of the horses acquired from the bandits' camp, a steady mare with a gentle disposition that seemed to understand the need for careful movements with her inexperienced rider. Adai rode nearby, occasionally signing directions or pointing out landmarks as the landscape gradually changed around them. They followed game trails through increasingly open terrain, the dense forest giving way to rolling prairie interspersed with wooded creeks. The land itself seemed to breathe more freely here, expansive horizons replacing the close embrace of forest canopy. As dusk deepened into true night, they made camp beside a small stream, the routine of establishing temporary shelter now familiar to all involved. Eliza found herself naturally included in these preparations, assigned tasks that matched her growing capabilities rather than her limitations. Around the evening fire, as food was prepared and distributed, she noticed subtle shifts in how she was received. Nuna offered a choice portion of meat, rather than merely fulfilling an obligation. Tsiyi, impressed by her father's tools, engaged her in a halting exchange about woodworking techniques. Even Akule acknowledged her presence with a brief nod when she passed him a water skin. Minimal, perhaps, but significant from one who had initially regarded her with open hostility. These small acceptances accumulated like individual stitches. forming a pattern in cloth, not yet complete, but suggesting the possibility of eventual integration. She remained different, would always remain different in fundamental ways, yet difference need not preclude belonging. That night, as the camp settled into sleep beneath a vast field of stars, Eliza found herself contemplating the extraordinary path that had led her to this moment. Less than 2 weeks had passed since the massacre, a heartbeat in the span of a lifetime, yet encompassing transformations she could never have imagined when the Hargrove wagon train had set out from Independence. She had lost a father, a future, a place in the world she understood. In their place, she had found unexpected allies, witnessed justice served outside the boundaries of formal law, and discovered capacities for adaptation she hadn't known she possessed. Whether these were adequate compensation for what had been taken remained uncertain, but they offered a foundation upon which something new might be constructed. The journey to the Cherokee village continued over the next 2 days, the landscape gradually shifting as they moved eastward toward the Arkansas River Valley. Occasional streams, fed by spring rains, necessitated careful crossings, the group forming human chains to ensure safety through swifter currents. During one such crossing, Eliza found herself supported by both Adahi ahead and Nuna behind, practical assistance that nonetheless symbolized her position. Between worlds, connected to both, yet fully belonging to neither. By midday of the 3rd day, signs of approaching the main village became apparent. Game trails widened into more established paths. Occasional clearings showed evidence of recent hunting or gathering activities, and twice they encountered Cherokee traveling in the opposite direction, their surprise at seeing a white woman among the hunting party evident but tempered by Grey Wolf's authoritative presence. Edie rode alongside Eliza as they navigated the final miles, his expression growing more thoughtful as they neared his home. Through careful gestures and deliberately formed words, he prepared her for what lay ahead. The layout of the village, the probable reactions to her arrival, the protocols that would determine her initial reception. Most significantly, he explained that while Grey Wolf's decision to bring her to the village carried considerable weight, the final determination of her status would rest with the tribal council. Until they convened to hear the full account of recent events, she would remain under his direct protection, a guest in his family's dwelling, her movements somewhat restricted, but her basic needs ensured. The arrangement made practical sense, but Eliza couldn't help noting the parallel to her initial reception at the hunting camp. Once again, she would need to prove her value, to earn trust, to navigate complex social dynamics without the advantage of hearing the nuances of conversation around her. The challenge was formidable, but not insurmountable. She had done it once, she could do so again. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley as they crested a final rise to reveal the Cherokee village spread below. Unlike the crude, frontier settlements Eliza had passed through on the journey west, this community displayed thoughtful organization, approximately 40 structures arranged in a pattern that balanced proximity with privacy, with a central council area marked by a large circular clearing. Most dwellings were substantial, some built of logs in a style similar to settler cabins, but with distinctive modifications. Others, more traditional structures with branch frameworks covered in bark or hide. Gardens in various stages of spring. Planting surrounded many homes, and a communal field for larger-scale cultivation occupied fertile bottomland near the river that curved around the village's eastern edge. Children playing near the outskirts were the first to spot their approach. Their excited reactions spread the news rapidly through the community, bringing people from various activities to observe the hunting party's return. The presence of extra horses laden with supplies would be cause enough for interest. The inclusion of a white woman in Cherokee dress guaranteed intense scrutiny, As they descended toward the village, Eliza straightened her posture despite the fatigue of travel. First impressions would matter significantly in the days ahead. Whatever uncertainty she felt internally, her external presentation needed to convey dignity and respect rather than fear or weakness. Adahi glanced at her as they approached the first dwellings, a flicker of what might have been approval crossing. His features, before his expression, returned to the careful neutrality required for their formal entrance. She had survived massacre, wilderness, and initial suspicion to reach this moment. What awaited her within the Cherokee village remained to be seen, but she faced it not as a victim seeking charity, but as one who had earned her place through shared struggle and demonstrated worth. The hunting party entered the village as afternoon transitioned toward evening, the golden light of approaching sunset illuminating their arrival like actors stepping onto a stage. For better or worse, Eliza Blackwood had reached the next chapter of her unexpected journey, one where her deafness might continue to be the very quality that allowed her to bridge worlds divided by history, language, and blood. The first weeks in the Cherokee village unfolded as a careful dance of boundaries tested and bridges built. As Adahi had explained, Eliza was housed with his family, an arrangement that introduced her to his mother, Walela, a weaver whose intricate basketry was renowned throughout the tribe, and his younger sister, Galilahi, who regarded the white woman with undisguised curiosity. Their dwelling was larger than Eliza had anticipated, with separate sleeping areas and a central hearth where family life centered. Her space was small but private, separated by woven reed partitions that provided visual if not auditory privacy, though for her, of course, the latter had never been a concern. Each morning began with Walela assigning household tasks, communicating. Through gestures that gradually incorporated Cherokee words, Eliza was expected to learn. The older woman proved to be neither overtly warm nor hostile, but practical in her assessment of Eliza's capabilities and limitations. When Eliza demonstrated skill at tasks requiring detailed handwork, Walela adjusted her assignments accordingly, waste of talent apparently being unacceptable regardless of its source. Adahi himself was often absent during daylight hours, his responsibilities as a hunter and tribal defender taking precedence over any obligation he might feel toward the woman he had brought into their midst. When present, he maintained a respectful distance, though his eyes occasionally followed her movements with an expression Galilahi seemed to find amusing, judging by the younger woman's poorly concealed smiles. Beyond the confines of Adahi's family dwelling, Eliza's reception in the broader community varied considerably. The elders, following Grey Wolf's lead, treated her with cautious acceptance, acknowledging her role in bringing justice to those who had attacked their people. Mothers with young children maintained watchful distance, neither welcoming nor openly hostile. Young men typically ignored her completely, while unmarried women studied her with gazes that assessed potential threat or competition. Only the children approached her without preconception, fascinated by her inability to hear and her different way of interacting with the world. Led by Woya, who had appointed himself her unofficial guide, they invented games that required no verbal communication, developing an impromptu sign language that blended Cherokee gestures with Eliza's own adaptations. As days passed, Eliza established a tentative routine. Mornings were devoted to household tasks with Walela and Galilahi. Afternoons often found her at the river's edge with other women, learning to prepare materials for Walela's baskets or helping with communal laundry. These shared tasks provided opportunities for observation and gradual integration, the rhythmic nature of the work requiring no verbal exchange, yet fostering a sense of shared purpose. It was during one such afternoon, approximately 2 weeks after her arrival, that a significant shift occurred. Eliza had been struggling to split reeds to the exacting thinness Walela required for her finest baskets, her frustration evident despite her determination. An elderly woman named Unol, who had previously shown little interest in the white newcomer, settled beside her with a grunt that Eliza felt rather than heard. With gnarled hands that belied their dexterity, Unol demonstrated a different technique, guiding Eliza's fingers with surprising gentleness. The method worked immediately, producing perfectly split reeds with significantly less effort. When Eliza looked up in grateful surprise, Unol's weathered face creased in a brief smile before returning to its customary stern expression. That evening, Unol appeared at Adahi's dwelling, presenting Eliza with a small stone tool clearly designed to facilitate the reed-splitting process. The gift was practical rather than decorative, yet its significance transcended its utilitarian purpose. It represented the first voluntary offering from someone outside her immediate circle, acknowledgement that her presence might have value beyond the unusual circumstances of her arrival. Adahi, observing this exchange from across the hearth, nodded once in apparent approval. Later, as Eliza helped Galilahi prepare the evening meal, he approached with uncharacteristic hesitation, gesturing toward the stone tool and then to the tribal council area. Tomorrow, he explained carefully so she could read his lips, the council would convene to hear the full account of the hunting party's confrontation with the bandits. They would also determine her more permanent status within the community. Unol's gesture, small though it might seem, represented important support from an influential elder. The council meeting the following day proved to be both more formal and more inclusive than Eliza had anticipated. The entire village gathered in the central clearing, forming concentric circles with the elders seated on log benches in the center. Grey Wolf presided, his weathered features impassive as he called for silence with a raised hand. Eliza was positioned between Adahi and Walela, close enough to observe the speakers' faces, but not so central as to suggest presumption of acceptance. A young man named Sequoia, whom she had noticed for his unusual interest in written language, was designated to assist her understanding, occasionally sketching symbols in the dirt to communicate concepts she might miss in the rapid exchanges. The proceedings began with a ceremonial acknowledgement of ancestral presence and guidance, followed by reports from various segments of the community: hunters, farmers, healers, and border watchers. These routine matters established the broader context before addressing the specific issue of Eliza's status. When the time came to recount the confrontation with the bandits, each warrior who had participated provided his perspective, describing not only the tactical details, but the spiritual and emotional dimensions of delivering justice for both Cherokee and settler victims. Their accounts emphasized the balance achieved, neither glorifying violence nor minimizing its necessity under the circumstances. Adahi spoke last among the warriors, his testimony notably including Eliza's role not just as identifier of the bandits, but as witness to both the original massacre and its eventual resolution. His description of her conduct throughout, her courage, her respect for Cherokee ways, her contribution of skills, presented a case for continued acceptance without directly advocating for it. Then, to Eliza's surprise, Walela rose to speak. The weaver's status in the community was evidently significant, judging by the attentive posture of the elders as she addressed them. Though Eliza could not hear the words, Sequoia sketched rapidly, conveying the essence. Walela spoke of observing the white woman in her home, of hands skilled in creation rather than destruction, of a spirit neither broken by tragedy nor hardened by vengeance. She concluded with a gesture toward Eliza's fingers, marked now with the calluses of basket-making, physical evidence of willingness to adapt and contribute. Following Walela came others, Unol briefly affirming the younger woman's assessment. Nuna describing Eliza's conduct at the hunting camp, even Akul grudgingly acknowledging her role in identifying the bandits who had threatened Cherokee families. Not all voices supported her continued presence. Two elders and several younger warriors expressed concerns about maintaining a white woman within their community, particularly as tensions with settlers continued to increase along territorial boundaries. Throughout these testimonies, Eliza maintained the composed dignity that had become her hallmark, neither displaying anxiety at negative assessments nor apparent relief at positive ones. When Grey Wolf finally signaled that she should approach the inner circle, she moved forward with measured steps, conscious of representing not just herself, but the possibility of understanding between divided peoples. The elder studied her face. For a long moment before speaking, his words formed with deliberate clarity for her benefit. "You have witnessed both the worst and best of Cherokee justice," Sequoia translated into written symbols. "You carry truth that could benefit or harm our people. What would you do with this truth if permitted to remain among us?" The directness of the question deserved equal directness in response. Eliza gestured toward the leather-bound ledger that had been presented as evidence earlier in the proceedings, then to her own eyes, and finally to the distant horizon in the direction of the nearest territorial authority. She would ensure the bandits' crimes were known to those with power to prevent similar attacks without exposing the Cherokee to unjust retaliation. "And after this task," Grey Wolf pressed, "what place do you seek here?" Eliza considered carefully, aware that her answer would significantly influence the council's decision. She pointed to her hands, then mimicked various tasks she had learned, splitting reeds, preparing hides, even the woodworking skills inherited from her father. Then, with deliberate movements, she indicated her ears and mouth before gesturing, to encompass the children of the community, followed by a teaching motion. Her meaning was clear. She offered practical skills for community contribution, but also the unique perspective of one who navigated the world without sound, knowledge that might benefit Cherokee children who experience similar challenges or simply expand the tribe's understanding of different ways of being. Grey Wolf's expression remained unreadable as he conferred quietly with the other elders. The discussion continued longer than previous deliberations, suggesting significant disagreement or careful consideration of implications beyond the immediate case. Finally, the elder raised his hand for silence, turning to address both Eliza and the assembled community. His judgment, translated by Sequoia's quick sketches, was measured but unprecedented. Eliza Blackwood would be permitted to remain not as captive or temporary guest, but as one who stands between, a designated role as bridge between Cherokee and settler societies. This position carried both privilege and restriction. She would learn their language and customs while maintaining knowledge of the white world. She would accompany trading parties to territorial settlements, helping to ensure fair exchange and accurate communication. She would teach Cherokee children, who showed interest in English writing and settler crafts, while herself learning tribal wisdom suited for sharing across cultural boundaries. Most significantly, she would take a formal place in Adahi's household, not as wife, a designation that would require ceremonies and considerations beyond the current decision, but as family not by blood, a status that provided protection and belonging while acknowledging her distinct origins. The pronouncement settled over the gathering with varying reactions, surprise, contemplation, and in some quarters, clear reservation. Yet Grey Wolf's authority remained unquestioned, his wisdom trusted even by those who might have preferred a different outcome. As the council dispersed, returning to interrupted daily tasks, Eliza found herself momentarily alone at the center of the clearing, the magnitude of the decision not yet fully processed. Her path forward had been defined with unexpected clarity, Not integration that denied her difference, nor isolation that prevented connection, but a distinct role that valued precisely the qualities that made her unique: her deafness, her experience. Across cultures, her position between worlds, Adahi approached. As she stood absorbing this realization, his expression more openly pleased than she had yet observed. Good. His lips formed the simple question, his raised eyebrow suggesting he already anticipated her answer. Eliza nodded, a smile breaking through her usual reserve. Good indeed. Better than she could have imagined when hiding beneath an overturned wagon, watching everyone she knew die around her. The relief must have shown plainly on her face, for Adahi's own expression softened further, the careful distance he had maintained in public settings momentarily forgotten. The months that followed saw gradual implementation of Grey Wolf's decree. Eliza's position evolved from theoretical designation to practical reality as she navigated the responsibilities of her unique role. Twice she accompanied trading parties to the territorial settlement at Fort Smith, her presence easing tensions that might otherwise have erupted into conflict. Her written account of the bandits' activities, supported by the recovered ledger, was delivered to a territorial judge known for fair dealings with native peoples, leading to official acknowledgement of the Hargrove Wagon Train Massacre as the work of white criminals rather than Cherokee raiders. Within the village, her integration proceeded unevenly but steadily. Waleila's initial pragmatic acceptance evolved into something resembling maternal concern, particularly evident in her insistence that Eliza learn proper preparation of traditional foods and medicines. Galilahi became a true sister in spirit, if not blood, their communication developing into a fluid blend of Cherokee signs, English lip-reading, and the intuitive understanding that grows between women sharing daily life. The children remained her most enthusiastic companions, particularly those drawn to her lessons in English writing and carpentry. Using her father's tools, now prominently displayed in a special corner of Adahi's dwelling, she taught basic woodworking to both boys and girls interested in the craft. Among these students, two demonstrated particular aptitude: Wasia, whose spatial intelligence translated well to three-dimensional creation, and a girl called Zitka, who was partially deaf from a childhood illness and found in Eliza both practical teacher and living proof that her difference need not define her limitations. Throughout this period of adjustment and growing acceptance, Eliza's relationship with Adahi developed with careful deliberation on both sides. His position as her primary advocate carried responsibility that precluded hasty emotional entanglement. Her status as one who stands between required maintaining certain boundaries to preserve her effectiveness in that role. Yet, within these constraints, connection deepened through shared experience and complementary perspectives. They developed rituals of communication unique to their circumstances. Morning walks, where Adahi would describe his planned hunting route using sticks to draw maps in the earth. Evening conversations by firelight, where Eliza would demonstrate new signs she had created with the children. Quiet moments of simply working alongside one another, he maintaining hunting tools while she practiced wood carving, comfortable silence, requiring no translation. As summer ripened toward autumn, bringing harvest festivals and preparation for winter months, Eliza found herself reflecting on the extraordinary transformation of her circumstances. Seated by the river on a rare afternoon of solitude, she traced patterns in the soil beside her, not random designs, but a written record of her journey from deaf carpenter's daughter bound for Texas to one who stands between in a Cherokee village. The sound of approaching footsteps registered as vibrations through the ground rather than audible warning. Looking up, she found Adahi standing several paces away, respectfully announcing his presence without startling her. In his hands he carried something wrapped in soft deerskin, a gift or message of some kind. He settled beside her at a proper distance, carefully unwrapping the object to reveal an exquisitely crafted wooden box. Its construction showed influence of both traditions. Cherokee symbolic patterns carved into wood, joined using techniques Edmund Blackwood had perfected in his Pennsylvania workshop. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft rabbit fur, lay her father's pocket watch alongside a necklace of polished river stones and carved wooden beads. The significance required no verbal explanation. The watch represented her past, her origins, the lineage of a father who had taught her to move through a silent world with confidence. The necklace symbolized potential future connection to this place and people, specifically to the man whose hands had crafted it during weeks of patient effort. Together in the box that blended both traditions, they offered not a demand for choice between worlds, but acknowledgement of her unique position bridging them. Adahi watched her face as understanding dawned, his own expression carefully controlled, yet vulnerable in a way she had not previously witnessed. When she looked up from the gift to meet his gaze, the question in his eyes required no translation. Was this welcome? Was this path one she might consider when appropriate time had passed and proper protocols observed? Eliza's response came not in words. She could no longer trust her voice to form clearly, nor in the signs they had developed for daily communication. Instead, she reached for her father's knife, carried always in the pouch at her belt, and carefully carved two simple figures in the riverside soil, a woman with no sound shown coming from her mouth, and a man with a bird soaring above his head. Between these figures, she drew the symbol Sequoia had created to represent standing between, not separated by this position, but connected through it, stronger because of the space they bridged. Rather than diminished by it, Adahi studied the drawing, his features softening into rare, full smile as he recognized her meaning. The path forward would not be simple. Proper courtship would require months of demonstrating compatibility, exchanging symbolic gifts, gaining approval from both family and tribal elders. Their union, should it become formalized, would face challenges from both Cherokee traditionalists and white settlers suspicious of cross-cultural relationships. Yet in this moment, these considerations receded before a simpler truth. Two people who had found unexpected connections across profound differences had chosen to explore where that connection might lead, not despite their distinct experiences of the world, but because these differences offered perspective neither could achieve alone. As afternoon sunlight filtered through autumn leaves, casting dappled patterns across their seated forms, Eliza Blackwood felt the weight of her father's watch in one hand and the texture of Adahi's carved beads in the other. The silence that had once isolated her had become the very quality that opened this unexpected path, first saving her life when attackers came, then allowing her to observe and adapt to Cherokee ways with a unique perspective, and finally creating space for understanding beyond words with the man beside her. What had begun in massacre and desperate survival had transformed into purpose and belonging. The journey between these points had demanded courage, adaptability, and willingness to value understanding over prejudice. As a woman who moved through a silent world, Eliza had become uniquely qualified to hear truths that often went unspoken between divided peoples. When Adahi rose to return to the village, offering his hand in the white man's gesture he had learned was important to her, Eliza accepted both the practical assistance and its deeper meaning. Together, they walked toward the dwellings visible through the trees, their shadows merging and separating with each step. Distinct individuals moving in shared purpose, navigating the complex territory between worlds not as a burden to be endured, but as a gift to be explored. The deafness that had once defined her limitations had revealed itself as her greatest strength, allowing her to survive when others perished and to build bridges where words alone had failed. In the silence that surrounded her always, Eliza had found not isolation, but a unique capacity to listen with eyes, heart, and spirit to the deeper rhythms that connected all people across the artificial boundaries of language, culture, and history. Up. Next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any. Upload from us.